Welcome to tonight's committee meeting. First of all, no need to come up. Everyone is.
Jack Ewing is not here.
Well,
Yeah.
we can come up to the Lord Mayor.
Deputy.
I'll move. Someone move. Thank you. Put that to the vote. All in favour?
Aye.
Thank you. Welcome. Confirmation of minutes.
No.
Zuko. Take to the vote. All in favour? Agreed. Thank you. Indications of pecuniary conflict of interest. There being none, transfer of agenda items. Move to the first substantive item, World Cities Summit Singapore.
Move.
And hand over to the Chief Executive.
Thank you very much, Chair. I might just state at the outset that Jackie and I are still working on quite a comprehensive report that will actually be presented to Council at its upcoming ordinary meeting. But tonight I've put together just a bit of a snapshot of some of the highlights of both the World Cities Summit, but also some takeouts from Singapore, of which in and of itself is a really interesting city, as most of you would be aware. So I might just, Craig, ask you to pop that up there. So firstly, just in regards to the World Cities Summit, so as part of the report that we're preparing, there'll be a link to the full program and also all of the papers that were presented at the forum. I think one of the really interesting takeouts for Jackie and I was the world challenges are really similar for most cities. So small cities, big cities, medium-sized cities, the challenges were fundamentally the same. And so there was a lot of time spent on talking about, obviously, climate futures and risks associated with climate, but more so, how do we actually adapt to a climate future, particularly in terms of looking at new industries, things like desalination plants, a whole range of things that countries were doing. And we've got a number of case studies of these that we'll share with you in the report. The other key takeout was really around housing. A lot of cities are actually experiencing, and these are OECD cities primarily, experiencing quite a significant shift in housing, and certainly pressure around housing has become a real focus for a number of cities. Obviously diversification in terms of the knowledge economy and other sectors across industry changing, and the sorts of challenges that come with that. There was quite a focus at the World Cities Summit on climate financing. So the World Bank actually presented on some of the thinking that they've been doing and the work with the private sector around how to fast-track investment in global projects that are actually sustainability focused, but also, how those are actually funded and prioritised at a sort of World Bank level. So that was quite interesting, and quite a few takeouts in a Hobart context about that I'd really like to do a much deeper dive with, certainly with Council when we present our more fulsome report. And there's certainly some things that we're already following up in that regard that I think do present a real opportunity for us with some of the commitments that Council's already made in terms of our sustainable action plan and other things that we're rolling out. The other key thing that was focused on at the summit was actually pandemic and crisis management. And this is, somewhat depressing, but there has been sort of some future foresight work done in regards to future pandemics and some of the challenges with population health, obviously coupled with sort of climate. So that's sort of an interesting nexus, I think, there that, is definitely worth exploring in more detail. But there was a session that Jackie and I attended. It was actually probably the last day of the conference that was actually about the risk of future pandemics, not only around COVID kind of continuing to be a presence in the world and probably in different, as we've seen it sort of mutate or whatever the proper saying on that is. But they're also talking about new and emerging viruses as well. So clearly monkeypox was talked about, Zika virus, and I think there's some concern around some of that modelling that's been done at the World Health Organization, that some of these things are going to start to come together and be experienced at the same time across the world. So without sounding, terribly dramatic about that, I think it is just important to note that there is work happening at the sort of world cities level around pandemic planning, crisis management, population health more broadly as it relates to dealing with pandemics. There's obviously a lot of work going on in terms of vaccine research and how to fast track vaccine provision. So it's interesting that that did take up quite a bit of focus, certainly on the last day of the summit. So I think for us in a Hobart context and certainly in a domestic national context, it's just important for us not to become complacent, you know, around COVID, and just be mindful that some of the settings and some of the learnings that we've had to endure as part of this COVID pandemic, you know, may make us more resilient for what's yet to come, but we can't take our eye off the ball. And I think there were some really strong messages about that at the summit. From an economic recovery point of view, most cities were very much focused on re-emerging from COVID. A lot of focus around placemaking at a sort of national level. Really, placemaking was seen as something incredibly important to the recovery of the economic activity within cities. And that's very much as a result of the future of work fundamentally changing. You know, you've seen a hollowing out of CBDs as it relates to office accommodation. And so the food and beverage industry, the activity, the public open space realm, and activating that with arts and culture has become an absolute necessity for a lot of the economic recovery in some of these cities, and these are big cities as well as some of the smaller cities that were represented at the forum. So some really good messages in that for us around the importance of placemaking, but having placemaking that actually integrates with that holistic land use planning and sort of broader health planning for, you know, populations as well. So lots of really interesting things covered. The report that we're compiling will be extensive, and I hope to serve as a bit of a resource going forward. We actually had suitcases full of things that we took away from Singapore, not so much from the summit itself, but Jackie and I had a series of meetings. We were really busy the whole time we were there, meeting a range of different stakeholders, government officials, partner agencies like, you know, our UTADS alumni and others. But certainly the meetings that we had with the development industry and certainly the government agencies was really invaluable. And there's lots of great examples of projects and sort of good planning that we really can take and use to sort of inform our approach here. Singapore is a country that's miles ahead, and we know that they've got a very different political system, of course, that makes streamlined decision making a little bit more time friendly, but nonetheless they are actually regarded as world leaders in urban planning. And we spent quite a bit of time doing a deep dive with some of the planning agencies centrally in Singapore, just about how they are dealing with the current challenges that they have, not dissimilar to here, although, as I said, a very different context. But they have had a significant heritage area, or several actually areas of heritage significance within the city, but they've managed to sort of integrate development in a really positive way that's very much sustainability focused. I was absolutely impressed with some of the buildings, the level of sustainability of those buildings, but moreover just the way that they were screened and the sort of the ability to integrate, you know, green into a lot of those really large buildings. Very impressive, dealing with the heat island effect, of course, within a very hot climate within the middle of a CBD. So lots of really interesting things going on. One of the other things that was particularly interesting was their ability to plan for the now and sort of the challenges that they experience at a sort of city level, particularly given their island status as well. It's a very small country, you know, in terms of land mass, but they're doing a lot of future thinking about what does their future city look like and how do they deal with the changing climate. And actually they've got a whole model city that's dedicated to what the future looks like. So they educate children, they educate community about, you know, climate futures and what that can look like in terms of industry, the way that we're going to spend time together, you know, in terms of parks and gardens and what our future buildings look like. And so it's been a really interesting, I think, immersion for Jackie and I, just into sort of seeing how a country like Singapore is tackling those big climate change issues, and they are leading the way, as I said, in terms of that integrated, you know, urban planning approach. So a lot to learn there, and we did bring a lot back. The big stuff, so we brought back some of the big urban sort of structure planning ideas, but equally there were some beautiful projects that we got to experience that were much more sort of neighbourhood based, love local, and there was a lot of emphasis on creating experiences during COVID, obviously, and a lot of countries did this, for people to explore their own backyards. And there were some really great examples of this in the Singapore context. So we've got quite a few project examples that we'll build on for our own city here in Hobart. Rediscovering heritage was a real theme. The cultural interpretation of heritage is done incredibly well in Singapore. And again, that would be a really good comparison to our heritage city here. And our cultural interpretation is probably something that we do need to focus on in a more meaningful way, particularly as it relates to locals experiencing stories and the buildings and the history here, but also understanding what that adds in terms of a tourist attraction as well, and just getting deeper into the understanding of the colonial history and First Nations history and other things here. So some great examples of projects that have really aimed to deliver on that. So we'll have more detail in the report, of course, but I've got a whole collection of resources that we did bring back, so I'm more than happy to share those with you. And as I said, we'll be running some sessions with our staff as a result of the trip as part of our presentation back for staff development as well. And we'll be having a list of things that we actually take on that we will trial in some of our own places. So it was terrific. I just wanted to highlight a couple of images just to give this a bit of colour and movement. The whole sort of theme for the World Cities Summit, and certainly what we spent time talking about in Singapore, was how do cities remain livable, sustainable and more resilient in these trying and unsettling times of both a pandemic and climate change. So that was very much the focus, as I said, of the conference, and lots of really good examples of work that's being done across the world. We obviously launched, or had a bit of a soft launch of our Invest Hobart strategy, which we'll talk a little bit more about this afternoon. Certainly the High Commissioner there sort of appreciated the opportunity for Jackie and I to take him through that, and it was great to sort of see his interest, obviously having come from Hobart, Tasmania, and just interested to sort of see some of what we've been talking about here post-COVID, but also what some of the future opportunities are for the city, both in an investment attraction perspective, but also in how we're focused on growing the knowledge economy locally. The Urban Redevelopment Authority of Singapore do some really interesting stuff, and that's really the central agency that I mentioned before. The way that they've designed sort of parks and gardens, the way that they've sort of looked at the sort of medium term to the longer term, and they've had, as I said, a real focus on respecting history, but also accommodating really significant growth. Their investment in public transport infrastructure is incredible. It's probably, one of the leading public transport networks, I think, in the world at the moment, because of their ability to be able to literally construct some of these new lines quite quickly. It costs $100,000 to put a car on the road in Singapore, so it does reduce quite significantly the number of cars able to be driven in the city, and that's obviously a longer term policy decision of the government of Singapore, but they are very much investing in people movement. Walkability is a challenge because it's so hot, so it's interesting all of the mobility solutions have sort of somehow integrated air conditioning systems and green pathwaying and canopy coverage along those kind of key linear areas within Singapore. These are just a couple of really great examples of some public art installations. Again, very controversial in the context of Singapore because it's quite, as you know, an authoritarian state. Everything's particularly well kept and maintained. This is actually a heritage precinct that really didn't have a lot of colour and movement, and it was a bit run down. So one of the shop owners actually started to just engage artists to start to paint murals and create a bit of colour and movement. I mean, this is something we're obviously used to seeing in parts of Hobart, but moreover parts of Melbourne and Sydney and other places like that. When I took these photos. It was actually quite early in the morning, so you can't see people there. But at night, absolutely bustling, incredibly full of life, really activated area. But it was interesting talking to the central agency people about how they implemented this. It was quite a significant project in terms of getting the heritage approvals through and getting the right balance between the preservation of heritage in certain areas and the ability to sort of be creative and activate, areas that were sort of tended to be underutilised previously. So they've got some great examples over there, and interesting guidelines that they've developed to help owners of these buildings, because they're quite unique little sort of heritage buildings, to do it in a way that's respectful of the character. And to see another couple of examples there. So it was really about achieving the right balance. So again, just an interesting context because of, Singapore's history and the way they've tended to govern moreover. Obviously, design has been seen as a kind of critical enabler for transformation to solve problems. So we spent a bit of time talking to Singapore's design lab, and these were sort of people who were really looking at solving a whole range of different sort of city issues through clever design. In some cases, these were about designing machines that were sort of recycling plastic or sort of repurposing different materials, through to, different sort of art design projects. So really interesting. Again, there's quite a lot of information that sits underneath this, but having things like a design week and really looking at how some of the local innovators and designers were sort of solving, some of those city large scale and small scale problems. These are just a couple of other examples of some of the heritage districts. Not all of the heritage districts are clearly painted or activated in that way, but these were just some that integrate, what is a very multicultural city as well. So it's interesting to sort of have that sort of multicultural lens on some of the cultural development work that they've been doing as a city. And there are areas that are really serious expressions of, a particular cultural community, and a lot of the festivals are really focused around celebrating that. It was fantastic to meet with the people who are running one of the big heritage festivals. It's actually the Night Festival in Singapore. Was actually inspired by Dark Mofo. So a lot of people in Singapore that we met knew all about Mona, they knew all about Hobart, and they knew all about Dark Mofo. And it was really fantastic to actually see just the influence that Dark Mofo's actually had, and the work of Dark Lab in really influencing people like David Chu. And these are large-scale festivals that they're running here through that heritage agency. But they'd actually come to Hobart and spent a bit of time with Lee and the team when they were looking at reshaping their festival model. So that was fantastic to sort of see how that night festival's come along as a result of the inspiration from Hobart. I think the other one we've sort of talked a little bit about, that was really about building an inclusive city. The parks and gardens and the preservation of some of those natural heritage assets is really very impressive, and the way that the city actually curates those experiences as well, so they don't just wait for people to just wander through a garden or a park or a foreshore. Often the places and spaces are actually curated and programmed to really draw people in. So that was quite interesting as well, and again something that we can potentially explore. So that's just a very quick run through. As I said, there's a very detailed report being prepared that will have a lot of links to further information, but a much more comprehensive synopsis of the summit itself, and sort of pulling out some of those themes and doing a bit of an analysis of where we can take some learnings and how we'll be applying that into our work at the City of Hobart. So thank you, Chair.
Well, fantastic introduction. Hesitatingly, I'll open it to questions. Alderman Zuko.
Oh, look, I haven't got any questions, but I do have some comments. And the first thing is, I'm absolutely glad our team has gone there, because I think over the years I've actually talked about these types of summits before, which are great. But I've been to Singapore quite a number of times. And what we've got to take into account about Singapore, it's completely different to Hobart. Now, to me, if we want to compare Singapore to Hobart, that means we've got to compare Singapore to Tasmania, and the capital city of Tasmania is Tasmania. Because we're not talking about a country that has a capital city, which is Singapore. So we're not talking apples with apples. Singapore is an amazing place. It's got, and I love going there because in amongst all their tall buildings, there's so much greenery and all that, and too bad you can't enjoy it so much because of the heat and the environment and all that. You know, their transportation services, I've been on them, they're amazing. It's great, but when you're talking about Singapore, you're actually talking about a country. We're not talking about a capital city. If we could restructure Hobart or Tasmania in light of Singapore, then we might as well get rid of a whole local government and have one government running the whole state, and there's no capital city of Tasmania. We've got Tasmania with the capital city of Tasmania. That's why Singapore is one of the most uniquest cities around, and as you walk around, it's the most cleanest city that I've ever been to in the world. You wouldn't want to put your chewing gum on the ground, because I assure you, you'll be shut down, because there's more cameras in Singapore than you can poke a stick at. Very much like Dubai. If anyone's been to Dubai and seen how they operate in Dubai, the King of Dubai can walk down the street and feel safe. My driver in Dubai, I remember my driver's actually in Singapore, very similar. But I remember my driver in Dubai said, oh, no, I asked him, why aren't you locking the car? He said, oh, don't worry, you're safe. No one's going to touch anything. So, look, you know, I think this is great that we can go to places, and mind you, I'll be supportive of us going anywhere around the world or anywhere to look at things, but we've got to be very careful to try and compare Singapore to Hobart. That's all I'm trying to get at. Because if we had the money that Singapore's got, by geez, we would have the best public transportation system around. We probably might end up during winter being able to have the underground walkways like Toronto has, so we don't have to worry about the coldness of shopping. Because if anyone's been to Toronto, you know, you just walk under the city in winter. So, look, you know, it's like Copenhagen, you know, it's got the best bikeways. You go to some of the cities I've been to in China, in Tianjin, 90% of the people have got bikes there. But, you know, if we had the money, if we had a government that had foresight, and we hadn't had foresight, we would have a completely different city. And I'd love to have the city of Singapore, but it's not going to happen in my time. Thank you.
Thanks, Alderman Zirko. Lord Mayor, anything from you? You're muted. You're on mute.
Thank you. No questions, but thank you. Very good.
Thank you. Deputy?
Thank you. Thanks for the report, and it sounds like you've had a really good experience and have brought back some fantastic ideas. I'm curious to know, because I think that pandemic planning is really important, and also that sort of future planning for the city. Do they have like the same sort of arrangement with a digital twin, and is there stuff that we have with our digital twin in that future planning that will be really useful to sort of imagine what we can use and how we might do that?
Through you, Chair, Deputy Lord Mayor, it's a really good question. One of the things that Jackie and I were particularly taken by was in the foyer area of the World Cities Summit. There was actually a whole range of displays, and 9 times out of 10, most of those displays were actually using LiDAR and essentially were digital twins. So once we're able to sort of improve on our approach here, we'll be able to connect up not only federally with a federated model here across the country, but also with some of these other countries internationally. And they are using a digital twin for a whole range of things, from heritage planning through to conservation, preservation, right through to, you know, interesting arts kind of projects and displays right through to population health planning as well. So there were some fantastic examples, and we're certainly, and I take Alderman Zuko's point, like we're a very different city, but there are still things that we can take, from some of these other examples around the world and sort of imagine them in our own context. And I think the digital twin's actually a really good example of how that same technology can be applied here in a Hobart context. We've just got to work with government to line up that investment to make it a reality.
Yep. And like during the pandemic, one of the things that we did, I think, and which was really important, was that connection to nature. So making sure that people could walk in parks and access as much as possible that we didn't shut down. Was the pandemic experience kind of that igniter, if you like, for them to do the same sort of thing with their parks and their sort of the use of spaces?
Through you, Chair, Deputy Lord Mayor, again, each country's had their own experience in that regard, but certainly that access to public space and parks and gardens has been something that all cities did. Once the sort of immediate sort of lockdowns stopped in some of the bigger countries, like in China and others, for instance, Singapore, certainly the government officials that we talked to in Singapore, they said it was an absolute catalyst for a complete change and reimagination of how they used their public spaces, because in Singapore they'd actually had a lot of their public spaces closed down, so they weren't able to be accessed by people. Then that was before COVID. They weren't places that people wanted to spend any time. So when COVID happened, they sort of reimagined the way that a lot of their public spaces, parks and some of their, I think, World Heritage listed sort of rainforest environments too, was sort of reused in a different way that had otherwise just been closed down and protected. And we heard stories really all over the world in terms of cities that were represented there about it being a catalyst for people using space really, really differently. And as we know, closer to home, it's meant that places that were locked up for a single sport use, for instance, like golf. There's a famous golf course in Melbourne where people started to use that as a place of recreation, not to play golf. And, the council's having to sort of work through that issue now about people wanting public access to essentially what was a private club, albeit council owned. So, I think, it's very much recognised that natural environment is here in a different way as a result, or being used in a different way as a result of COVID, and we're no doubt with future pandemics, but also think with climate as well, in terms of people's awareness of that need to green and manage some of those heat effects.
Yep, and just one final question and point. I think it's really important to be able to imagine what might be, but with the former Premier Will Hodgman there as High Commissioner, what was there? Did you see some sort of synergy and opportunity directly with Singapore as well?
Through you again, I think that's something that we really do need to explore in a meaningful way. So the answer is yes. I think the High Commissioner was particularly interested in where Hobart is at the moment and some of the work that we're doing. He was very interested in working with us to connect with some of those key industries that we've talked about previously that, are potentially areas that we'd want to seek out in terms of the knowledge economy. Certainly, I think the next opportunity will be for us to have some more direct conversations with Singapore Airlines, for instance, but also some of those other industries that we've talked about in a kind of climate futures sense. And some of these companies are actually based and they're scaling up in Singapore, startups and so on. So we'll be looking at those opportunities. But the High Commissioner was very supportive and did introduce us to some key people as well, and post our visit also. So we met people there, and we've also connected sort of online with people subsequently, which was great. Thanks.
Thanks, Deputy. Councillor Dutta.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for the report, and I found it quite interesting. Now, I don't usually want to talk about my own experiences, but here, let me also simply reflect on a few things. A number of us, no doubt, have been to Singapore, and my first time when I went there some years ago was the beautiful airport that I landed in, and so that really blew me away to begin with, and the greenery that was there. But then I was introduced to Little India, where I could relate to my own people. And one of them said to me, you know, we are Indians and Chinese, and the Indians only fear the Chinese. They are the only one who can beat us in business. But it was interesting to know that these two ethnicities have come together and produced such a wonderful, you know, the things that we can learn from. I'm quite impressed with their livable city and sustainable city, the issue for climate change. I think that's fantastic, and the green that they're wanting to bring about. As Alderman Zuko has mentioned, you know, I also have the similar experience. My son-in-law is from Copenhagen. My daughter and the husband lived in Luxembourg for 15 years. And Luxembourg is one of the best cities that I have been to, you know, in comparison to Singapore with the free transport. And they just arrived back to live in Hobart on Monday. But what I'm saying is that for me, there are so many lessons we can learn. Even though we can't compare them, but the lessons we learn, we can transplant them here. And so I've got two questions. Question number one is to do with parking. How do they deal with parking? And question number two, do they have local governments? And how many local governments would they have if they do have?
Thank you. They don't have local government as such, Chair. So they've got a very different model of government, as you know. So essentially it's a central government and then a number of sort of regional governments. And, you know, I think one of the distinct investments that's made in Singapore, irrespective of the sort of political sort of structure of the country, and we know that that is authoritarian rule, as we've discussed, but they do invest their sort of brightest and smartest people in the government sector. So, you know, sometimes in other countries you see the smartest and brightest going into other fields like law or what have you. Certainly in Singapore there's a real focus on people who are doing well, good performers going into government senior roles. So you've got a lot of people that are incredibly well educated, actually leading ministerial portfolios and things like that. They invest heavily in their government bureaucracy and in training, development and research. So I think that's an interesting thing too. Thank you, Chair.
And is that all, Councillor?
Yeah, just one other question. What about e-scooters? Do they have e-scooters there?
Sorry, through you, Chair. You did ask me about parking as well, which I'll come to. I think they did at a point in time, and I do need to just do a bit of research on that's one of the things that we'll look at as part of the report, but no longer. I did see some individual scooters, but not provided by a sort of mainstream company. And parking, most of it's private parking and very little on-road parking. So most of it's multi-storey or basement style parking.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. The only question I have is your meetings with private enterprise that were arranged, and I've been a great advocate of the conference itself, but what was the appetite, did you think, for investment in Australia and particularly in Tasmania at this point from those private sector organisations you met?
Thank you, Chair, and I think this is something that we're continuing to explore, thanks to the High Commissioner. Like, we've been put in touch with a range of people who can facilitate some further meetings. I think if you have a look at what's going on in Singapore at the moment, and you can see some of this playing out in the mainstream media, Australia is an area of high interest for Singaporeans. And there are a number of major sort of multinational companies that are actually based in Singapore as well. So it's very much seen as a gateway. So it may not be Singapore kind of based, or it might be Singapore-based companies we're dealing with, but it could also be companies from other cities that are sort of using Singapore as a bit of a gateway and a connector into Australia. So we are certainly an important country for them in terms of investment and trade, but we've got a bit of work to do, I think, to sort of talk about Hobart specifically, and that was really our intent, was to sort of start to formalise some of those discussions with the High Commission and also utilise those networks as well as the networks of the alumni that are there as well. There are people who have studied in Hobart who are incredibly successful business people, and we did meet a number of those individuals who are, you know, in a whole range of different industry groups now in Singapore. So I think, Chair, just to summarise, it really is the beginning of our work in Invest Hobart, but also in terms of those relationships that we can forge over time with government, with community, sort of stakeholders as well of interest around education and so on, but also with industry partners over time. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, thank you very much. That's a great session. Could I get someone please to move that we... Thank you, Alderman Zurko. I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour?
Aye.
Thank you very much, CEO. 6.2, Invest Hobart, Investment Prospectus. Jackie, do you want to make any mention up front?
Oh, look, I guess I need to note that this is the further iteration of the version that we showed you before we went to Singapore. It's intended as a framework for how we will continue to evolve our investment prospectus. Obviously, some of the information in it will change as we get new statistics and as we get feedback from people. So it's intended to be a live document. At the moment, it's a physical document, but the intention is also to create a web-based presence for Invest Hobart, which will allow us to keep that information dynamic and also to provide some, I guess, deeper material like case studies and things like that. So I guess really presented to this committee as the framework for how we want to move forward with Invest Hobart documentation.
I'll open it for discussion.
Well, I'm not going to move it, but if I do move it, I'll move it with an amendment. Not that I've got every faith in our CEO, and I fully support our CEO. But insofar as any policy documents, I believe that elected members must be part of any policy changes. I cannot support 2 in the way it is at the moment, because it's saying here to delegate the future approval of future amendments to the document in question. To me, and again, no disrespect to the CEO, the CEO's got my full support, but I've put up many times about delegating to the CEO, but when it comes to policy documents, I'd like them to come back for us to ratify. And I'd like to move, if I can, I'd like to move 1, and I'd like to move an amendment to 2, in the sense of that any amendments to the document come back to committee and council. And I have, and this could be as easy as having a meeting just before council, just to clarify and ratify those changes. I don't think it's detrimental to the CEO. It just ensures and makes sure that we as elected members don't read the paper tomorrow that, you know, Alderman Zurko is in Singapore climbing buildings or something like that. If that change has to happen, I'd like to be part of the approval.
Alderman Zurko, just if you look at 2, just have, instead of the Chief Executive be delegated the authority to start with council approve any future amendments.
Yeah, that's fine. You know, that's okay. You know.
Lord Mayor?
I think, can we add the word substantive amendments? Because, I mean, if there's just update to data, because a lot of the document is about data, so if it's next year, there's a change in business numbers, I would think that coming back to council would be a little bit of not really what you were intending.
Look, data is not an amendment. It's about amendment to the document in the sense of you know, there's a document here. There might be an amendment to the document in manners of the way something's processed. Look, I'm not talking about data. Data interchanges on a you know, I believe any.
Substantial. I think maybe add the word substantial.
Add the word substantial.
The only other alternative would be council approve any future amendment to the document titled Invest Australia, Tasmania, Hobart, whatever we are, other than data update.
That's fine. Other than data update.
Is that okay, Lord Mayor? Other than data update, that'll pick up the change.
Yeah.
Deputy.
Chairman, sorry, Lord Mayor.
I was just going to ask a general background question about, I guess I'm just wondering whether we've learned anything from maybe some, in terms of what we've done here with the Invest Hobart Prospectus, whether we've actually sort of tapped into some best practice examples of cities that have seen a real step change in interest in them and what they've done to do that. Because I think, you know, city investment prospectuses can be a bit dime a dozen. And how do we sort of actually do something kind of brave, as to quote from our vision, that really does actually attract attention and interest. And I guess, yeah, has the prospectus really done a deep dive into some cities that have done something sort of bold and really sort of attracted some new investment? Because I'm not sure we'll necessarily have just through a document and sort of emails and conversations with people, whether that's really going to be enough to actually attract some of these kind of new knowledge economy players that you're really after. So that's a first question, I guess, long question. And the second question is just, what is the role of the Office of the Coordinator General in this next step? And have we done any analysis about whether we could ask them particularly to take any of these items forward, and if so, which ones?
Through to you, Jackie, yes.
Through you, Chair. If I can respond to the first question. So I guess it's important to note that this is the beginning of the Invest Hobart process. So we don't envisage that this document, I guess, will do all the work, but it is the beginning of how we want to frame up Hobart as a place that, as you say, Lord Mayor, is distinctive from other places that are also competing with us for investment. So whilst we have looked at some other examples of investment prospectuses for different places, and we've certainly based some of the information on things that we know people want to know about cities, we've also worked very closely with Brand Tasmania around the look and feel and the narrative of this document. And we've spent quite a bit of time talking with our colleagues in State Growth and Office of Coordinator General around how Hobart can, I guess, dovetail in underneath a whole of state investment strategy. So, as I said, the branding and the look and feel is very much aligned with the Brand Tasmania look. The intent is that when people are travelling on trade missions and things like that into the future, Hobart is something that can be recognised as part of that Tasmanian brand, but has a very specific voice. And certainly from our perspective, that voice is very different to the way other capital cities are talking about themselves and selling themselves at the moment. But as I said, this is absolutely the beginning of an iterative process. It's a calling card, if you like. It gives us the opportunity to start having conversations with people. We do intend it will be a dynamic document that we refine. We do intend there'll be a whole range of electronic resources and programs of activity that underpin this. It was really an opportunity for us to put a peg in the sand as to how we want to start talking about Hobart as an investment destination. And so, yes, in terms of your further question around the role with the Office of Coordinator General, we've certainly had a number of conversations with that office around what some of the key industry segments are and opportunities for us to work with them around investment attraction and the kinds of activities that City of Hobart can undertake that will back in the work that OCG is doing and State Growth is doing, and we would intend to continue those conversations and relationships.
Does that assist you, Lord Mayor? I guess just from the chair, my comment would be that if you were going to see, obviously, if you're going to go and see somebody who's really in that IT or creative industry or something, you would give them this, but you'd give them a particular bulk presentation for that particular industry. So,
Absolutely.
I want to still make some other comments, but sorry, Deputy, have I been
Oh,
past?
thank you. Yeah, so just a question, a sort of basic question. So this is a prospectus, prospectus, I can't even say it. It's not a policy, is it? It's a prospectus. Right, okay, so we're not talking about a policy and, you know, so it's not really that we're looking to change or that you'd want to be changing. Secondly, I know that we've had this presentation in March in relation to putting together this prospectus and seeing the draft back then. What is the input into that? Jackie's sort of talked about the process, you know, what we're trying to get out of it, but you know, what has gone before that to get to this point? You know, like what sort of discussions have been, you know, and I suppose to get to what I think is, if I understand Alderman Zuko's point, the policy side of you know, this push to get further investment.
Thanks, Deputy Lord Mayor. And as Jackie said, this is really our first foray after some time into an investment prospectus. The last one you'll recall was kind of China focused. The Invest Hobart work has really come out of some analysis that we've done, to Lord Mayor's point actually, about what other cities have done to create investment. And there's a range of sort of strategies that would sit under this. What's informed the first iteration was actually the economic development roundtables that we held. So that was essentially our kind of foray into more in-depth stakeholder engagement in relation to this particular prospectus itself. But there'll be a range of further consultation and engagement as we form up the economic development strategy. So I guess the distinction between the two things is that Invest Hobart was really about us kind of restating the role of Hobart as a gateway, as Jackie said, like a gateway to investment for the state of Tasmania, and to make sure that we were sort of lining up with sort of the federal state kind of priorities really, and that we influence those as well. The economic development strategy is in development as we speak, and that's obviously something that we'll be engaging council with in the new term now of council, and that will probably necessitate, once that's resolved and fully formed, that will then probably necessitate an update in Invest Hobart as well, because we'll have more in-depth understanding of where we need to pivot to. And the beauty of the prospectus is that it's a light touch document insofar as it's something that, you know, creates the right look and feel, but we can, you know, kind of update it regularly to sort of reflect new interest as well as new information. So, yeah, and as Jackie said, there'll be a lot of other things that we build up to support the prospectus that's sort of sitting at that higher level.
Okay, and yeah, so essentially, I mean, those things that you'd be changing focus.
Yes, so through you, Chair, to Deputy Lord Mayor, Jackie might like to add to this. I mean, my understanding is that we have iterated this, so this is the second sort of iteration you're seeing tonight. I think as we're talking with, you know, the likes of the Consul General, other, you know, people sort of preeminent, you know, within sort of investment attraction circles, there might be some things that they suggest to us to tweak. You know, if you thought about adding something on this, you know, if we learn new things or there becomes a particular segment of industry that we need to be speaking to in a different way, and I'm pulling this out of my head, but things like the medical research industry, you know, there might be a unique opportunity to sort of pursue that potential as part of, you know, a precinct development we're doing. We might add that. I think that's really the intent. But again, we can report that through to council, you know, on an as-needs basis. I think our concern around timing this time was purely caretaker and the election impending, that's all.
Just a point I'd like to make, but this prospectus is like a policy document, and the potential could be that it could be amended to say that the City of Hobart will support investment in nuclear power or something like that. I'm being far-fetched. I'm just saying that this is what these type of documents are about. So whether it's we're going to go down the track of investing in nuclear power or investing in more public transport, if there's any changes to this document, I think it's just appropriate that we have some say in it. That's all it's about.
We've got that through the amendment. Councillor Dudder.
Just one observation with regards to the prospectus. Is there a state prospectus as well, and we have as a capital city, and how closely are we working with the state growth with regards to this?
Through you, Chair, we're working very closely with Department of State Growth. However, we have taken a slightly different approach in how we're presenting ourselves, and we are aligned more closely with Brand Tasmania in trying to, I guess, rise up a little bit above the kind of normal bureaucratic way these kinds of documents are presented. But I do want to reassure the committee that we're working very, very closely with our colleagues at State Growth for two reasons. One is we want to obviously get most bang for our buck and make sure we're optimising on opportunities that they're creating, and we also don't want to be in the business of cutting across things that are already happening.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Look, I'd just like to say well done, congratulations. It's a really strong presentation, and obviously for defined groups and defined interest groups, you would flesh that down to be the actual document. But when someone's generally looking at Hobart, this would be an excellent overview that people can refer to look at the capability for, it can be used for a whole host of things. I'm assuming it'll be on our website, and I'm assuming that it will then be used as a target for appropriate sustainable development. Thank you. Could, first of all, we have an amendment to deal with, which was...
I've actually moved the motion with the amendment.
Can we have the amendment separately, please?
Yeah, the amendment reads, it's amended by Alderman Zerko. The Council approve any future amendment to the document titled Invest Hobart other than data updates. Is everyone clear of that, what the amendment is intended? I'll put the amendment. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against?
No.
I'll show of hands. Lord Mayor, are you in favour, please? I don't mean please, but thank you, Councillor Dudder. So we have just the Deputy Lord Mayor as against the amendment. That moves into the substantive document. It's been moved by Alderman Zerko. I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against? That's carried unanimously. Thank you very much. I'll move now to committee action status report. Somebody?
Chair.
Thank you, Deputy. Anybody wish to raise any matter on that list? Thank you. I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour of accepting that? Vote. Everyone approved? Questions without notice on the open? There being none, I'll close. Oh, I'm sorry. There we are. I'm not used to seeing this side. There we are. Thank you, Lord Mayor. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I guess just came up in my mind with the CEO talking about the ongoing sort of challenges with pandemic and living with pandemics and that sort of thing. So can we get a summary of current work that's being done to encourage and assist outdoor dining, outdoor seating, I guess, generally, in the City of Hobart? And are there any future plans that are already sort of future plans that are part of existing strategies or programs?
Thank you. Have you noted that, David? Thank you. Thank you, Lord Mayor. Anybody else? No? Then I'll close the open and thank you very much, Kat. I'll open the